All right, so our next unit is going to be metabolism. We just finished going over a cell membrane test, and we've updated our My Honors Biology grade goal tracking sheets. So now we're going to move into metabolism. This unit has three distinct parts. There's ATP, which we're going to discuss today. There's cell respiration, and there's photosynthesis. So let's begin. So what to expect from this unit? We'll discuss the ways and means that cells use that ATP to get energy. We've talked about it in our last unit with sodium potassium pump or just active transport in general, that it's going against that concentration gradient from low to high concentration. And when doing so, that requires energy. So that energy in the cell is ATP. How does cell respiration convert glucose, remember that monosaccharide that we get from our digestive system after it breaks down our food, into usable ATP? How does it diffuse through the membrane, get to the mitochondria, and then go through cell respiration there? And how is photosynthesis the other half of that cycle, where it uses, or actually creates glucose using water, carbon dioxide, and energy from the sun, or light. Excuse me. How the process of photosynthesis and cell respiration depend on one another. They're interdependent. It's a cycle. We'll talk about that. And how the Earth's ecosystems depend upon this balance. So you might be asking yourself, why are we covering this? Why does this matter? Well, first of all, it's a criteria of all living things. Remember, all living things are made of cells and maintain homeostasis. That's basically our last two units. This next one is another criteria. All living things have to have some sort of complex chemistry or have a metabolism. So that's one reason. Another reason is the ability of living things to convert energy from one form to another is an essential biological characteristic, as in it's a characteristic of all living things, bio meaning living. Virtually all other biology processes depend on either photosynthesis or cell respiration. Again, they're interdependent. The relationship between photosynthesis and cell respiration, it's fundamental to all ecosystems. Like I said before, it's an essential cycle. Right? And understanding the independence of these processes can help explain real-world problems, things you might run into in your own life either now or in the future, things like obesity, bringing in more calories than expending, right? Or climate change, talking about the out-of-whack balance that's going on between photosynthesis and cell respiration can help us explain these real-world problems. So let's begin. First part, like I mentioned earlier, is going to be ATP. So from this brief discussion, you should get, hey, what do cells use ATP energy to do? How do they harvest energy from ATP? And then how are they able to make more ATP? See, here's a molecule of ATP. It's kind of cool. All right, so what is ATP? Well, it stands for adenosine triphosphate, ATP. The tri means three, as in tricycle. So you might notice adenosine sounds like adenine. Well, it is. It's a variant form of adenine, which you see in your DNA. It's one of the four bases we discussed earlier. All right, ribose, another part, that you might have recognized from RNA. It says here part of DNA. That's a typo. All right, and then there's three phosphates. Again, tri as in three. So that's the other part of DNA. So adenosine triphosphate. It's the energy currency that your cells rely on. Say you go to the Buckle and you want to buy 3 pairs of jeans and you go to the counter and it's $1,800. Well, you need currency. You give them money, they give you these 3 pairs of jeans that are ridiculously overpriced. The cell operates the same way. You want to pump 3 sodium or 2 potassium molecules one way or another. Well, for that to happen, you first have to provide a certain amount of ATP that's going to operate that protein pump. So the bonds holding these phosphates together create energy. So these are chemical bonds, and that's where chemical energy is found. So you can see here's the phosphate groups. Together, the ribose adenine together makes adenosine. So A, and then 1, 2, 3, TP. All right, here's another molecule of ATP, just kind of zoomed in. You don't see the different parts kind of highlighted, but again, this was adenosine, and this is 1, 2, 3 phosphates. Where else have we heard phosphates? That's right, very good. Right? The polar head or hydrophilic head of a phospholipid is really a phosphate group. Good job. So this PO4 structure might look familiar. So chemical bonds contain energy. I just alluded to this, but energy is required to make these chemical bonds. We're going to talk about cell respiration later on, and energy is released when they break. All right, this energy comes in the form of heat or light, and you can convert that energy into other forms, albeit, perhaps it's mechanical, perhaps it's chemical, anything like that. So imagine you're hiking through the woods, you're walking around, and you step on a twig. What happens? Snap that twig, it releases a sound, right? Well, that's actually mechanical energy. Energy that was trapped in that twig that snaps, it kind of vibrates through the air, moves your eardrum back and forth, and your brain interprets that as sound or mechanical energy. The same thing happens when you break a chemical bond. It releases heat and light. Here's an example. So you've got a propane grill or you're barbecuing or something like that. Well, you've got C3H8. That's a lot of, chemical bonds that's holding this hydrocarbon together. It's hydrocarbon because it's only made of hydrogen and carbon, right? You combine that with fuel as an oxygen as part of your fire triangle. Once it combusts, you've got carbon dioxide, water, and then most importantly, heat and light energy is released. If you see a flame, maybe it's blue, maybe it's orange or yellow. Hopefully it's not white hot. But if you see a flame, don't touch it. It's hot, obvi, right? And it also is bright, all right? It's going to release light energy as well. So you notice here, reactants and products. That's something that's going to come up time and again this unit with cell respiration, photosynthesis, and ATP. You got your reactants, that's what's needed to react on this side of the equation. Once you go through, notice it's a one-way arrow. Once you go through the reaction, now you've got your products. So the reactants are required to react. The products are what's produced. So in this case, propane and oxygen gas are your reactants. The products are carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Later on in photosynthesis and cell respiration, again, we already talked about that cyclical nature, at least we alluded to it. We're going to talk about how the products of one process are actually the reactants of another. So how is energy released from ATP? Like we just spoke about, when you break those chemical bonds, in this case, we're breaking the chemical bond between the second and third phosphate. When you break those bonds, it releases that energy. So we say that energy is released when ATP is hydrolyzed. Hydrolyzed, like hydro, just a way to say water is involved. So you have a molecule of ATP. Maybe it floats up to a protein pump of some kind, or like latches onto a little, vacuole, and it's going to move it down a cytoskeletal fiber through the cell. When you do this, whenever you have water attached to it in such a way, it actually breaks that bond, releases quite a bit of energy, believe it or not. And then what do you have left over? Well, you have ATP, that's 3. If you break off one phosphate group, now you have ADP, as in adenosine diphosphate. So diphosphate meaning 2. Well, that extra phosphate's floating around, so you've got ADP, a regular phosphate floating around, and then most importantly, you've got that energy. Got that energy, okay? So energy is released from ATP when it's hydrolyzed with water. That creates ADP, water, and energy. Sorry, not water. You use water to create ADP, an organic phosphate, and energy. So what do cells use it to do? Well, what type of functions do we have? See here, Cladomonas, right? It's a little organism, but basically to move these flagella back and forth, similar to what you've seen on a sperm before, only there's more than one flagella here. 2 flagella on a sperm would render it moot almost, but that's another topic for December, basically. Anyways, you take ATP in here, and it's not necessarily a protein pump, but it works in a similar fashion. When ATP attaches to it, it breaks that bond, releasing ADP, phosphate, and an energy to move the flagella back and forth. Well, that causes this Cladomonas to move through, its modal that way. All right, maybe it's moved for transport work, like we talked about in our last unit, the cell membrane, to these things diffuse in and out of the membrane on their own. Well, maybe you want to work them against their concentration gradient. To do that requires ATP, or energy. ATP makes its way to the pump. You hydrolyze that third phosphate, use water to break it off, and that creates ADP and phosphate, and most importantly, energy to move things against the concentration gradient. Notice here is from low to high. Or maybe it's chemical work, such as making, complex molecules out of maybe simple sugars, and you're going to use ATP to put more monosaccharides together to make bigger disaccharides or polysaccharides, things to store a lot of energy. We're thinking of photosynthesis here. So how do we get more ATP? Well, energy from glucose, which we get out of our food, is released and used to reattach that phosphate to the diphosphate. And when that happens, you've got ATP again. So again, it's a cycle. You've got products and reactants. Your reactants here are ADP and phosphate. Here's ADP, here's phosphate. You stick that phosphate back on to the ADP, and now you have ATP again. I think it's as easy as 2 plus 1 makes 3. There it is, right? So you have energy from food to make ATP, and that gives you your energy from your cells. In fact, some cells have more mitochondria or make more ATP than others, things like muscles and whatnot. But on the whole, the human body recycles its own weight in ATP every day. I mean, that is a lot. This thing weighs, it's almost negligible how little mass it has. But we're making so much of it and using so much of it for every cellular process you could possibly think of outside of diffusion and things like that. Anything at all that requires energy, we're making so much of it that we actually recycle our body weight every day. Here's another, like we said before, another just zoomed in diagram of that process. Here you've got ATP, here's your adenosine, here's your triphosphate. Well, that's the product. Your reactants were ADP plus phosphate, 2 plus 1, we're going to get 3. How does the energy from, or where does the energy come from to attach this phosphate to this diphosphate? Well, it comes from our food. It comes from the chemical energy stored in those chemical bonds as glucose. We have this, now it goes as ATP off to cells to perform whatever cell function where energy is required. So, what should you have gotten from this? Again, what do cells use ATP energy to do? We discussed 3 things in particular. How do cells harvest energy from ATP? So, out of this triphosphate molecule, how do we get energy out of it? And then we kind of prefaced how do cells make more ATP. In the future, we're going to talk about cell respiration and photosynthesis in more detail.